Okay guys, tonight we begin with something very low stakes, very quiet, and extremely uncomfortable. So dim the lights. Put your phone face down. Maybe imagine a gentle fireplace sound that you forgot to turn on. And let's slowly drift back to a time when going to bed was less of a comfort ritual, and more of a brave personal challenge. Because tonight, we're talking about medieval beds. Not romance. Not passion. Noticeably less Netflix. Just wood. Straw. Bugs. And the quiet emotional acceptance that this was as good as it was going to get. Now, when we say medieval bed, your brain might try to help you. It might picture a grand wooden frame. A canopy. Heavy curtains. Maybe something vaguely royal, because of course it does. And yes, those beds did exist. But only if you were extremely rich, politically important. Or married to someone who inherited land by accident. For everyone else, a medieval bed was. Let's call it a horizontal compromise with reality. Most people slept on a straw mattress. And by mattress, we mean a sack. A literal sack. Filled with straw. Sometimes hay. Occasionally leaves, if you were feeling experimental. This sack was called a palliasse. Which sounds elegant, until you realize it was basically a burlap bag of farm leftovers. The straw inside had one job. And that job was not comfort. It was separation. Separation between your body and the cold, unwelcoming ground. And even then, it was doing the bare minimum. Straw breaks down quickly. It shifts. It pokes. It develops opinions. If you didn't replace it often, it turned into dust, sharp fragments, and regret. And replacing it often meant more straw. Which you also needed for animals. And insulation. And literally everything else. So most people just lived with it. Now, above the straw mattress, if you were lucky, you had a blanket. If you were very lucky, you had two. If you were aristocracy, you had sheets. Sheets were not common. They were a flex. Clean fabric was expensive, time-consuming, and required someone else's labor. So sleeping directly on straw was normal. Your blanket went on top of you, not under you. Which means the straw touched your face. Your arms. Your dignity. And that straw was not clean. It had lived a full life before it met you. It had been walked on. Eaten near. Exposed to weather. And then stuffed into a sack and handed over like good luck. Sweet dreams. Now let's talk about the bed frame. Because for many people, there wasn't one. The mattress sack was placed directly on the floor. Sometimes on a wooden board. Sometimes on a pile of rushes. Which were dried plants scattered on the floor for insulation. Rushes were replaced, occasionally. Not frequently. Occasionally. They absorbed spills. They absorbed dirt. They absorbed whatever was happening nearby. And yes, animals walked on them. Chickens. Dogs. Cats. Sometimes pigs, if things got confusing. So when medieval people went to bed, they weren't retiring for the evening. They were joining the ecosystem. Now, richer households did have raised beds. These were wooden frames, often very solid, very heavy, and absolutely not designed for comfort. They were designed for status. A raised bed said, "I am not sleeping on the floor like the peasants." Even if the mattress was still terrible. The frame lifted you away from drafts, from dampness, from rodents who preferred ground-level negotiations. And yes, rodents were a thing. Rats loved medieval homes. They loved warmth. They loved straw. They loved crumbs. And medieval beds offered all three. So people hung their beds from ropes, or raised them on legs with metal discs, called rat guards. Because nothing says bedtime relaxation like engineering solutions for rodents. Now let's drift gently toward royalty, because their beds were different. Royal beds were enormous, heavy, decorated, symbolic. They were less place to sleep, and more furniture that knows its own importance. A royal bed could have a canopy, curtains on all sides. Not for romance, for warmth, and privacy, and to keep insects out of your face. Curtains also trapped heat, which mattered, because medieval castles were cold. Stone does not care about your comfort. A canopy bed was essentially a personal microclimate. A fabric bubble where you could exist without freezing. Now, inside that royal bed, the mattress situation improved slightly. Instead of straw, you might get feathers. Feather beds were the height of luxury. They were soft. They molded to the body. They also smelled. Feathers came from birds. Birds are not known for cleanliness. Feather beds had to be fluffed constantly. They shifted. They clumped. They developed cold spots. And sometimes, insects lived inside them. So yes, you were warm. But you were also hosting. Royal beds also had another function. They were public. This is the part modern brains struggle with. Important people did not sleep alone. Not in the privacy sense. Servants came and went. Advisors might be present. Doctors checked on things. Courtiers waited nearby. A king going to bed was a small event. There were rituals, assistants, ceremony. Because the king's body was political property. And bedtime was just another state function. Imagine trying to relax. Now let's slide gently over to sleep positions. People did not sleep flat on their backs. That was considered dangerous. It was associated with death. Instead, people slept propped up. Half reclined. With pillows. Pillows were often stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers. And they were not soft. They existed to elevate the head. Because medieval medicine believed that lying flat allowed fluids to rush to the brain. Which, of course, would cause problems. Naturally. So sleep was a careful balancing act. between breathing, digestion, and not accidentally dying in your sleep, apparently. Now let's talk briefly about bed sharing, because yes, everyone did it. Beds were shared by couples, by children, by servants, by guests. Space was limited. Beds were expensive. If someone was staying over, they got in the bed. If a servant needed to be nearby, they slept at the foot. If children existed, they were added like accessories. Privacy was not a concept yet. It was more of a future aspiration. And beds were warm. That mattered. Body heat was one of the best heating systems available. So piling people together was practical. Romantic. Sometimes. Mostly logistical. Now, cleanliness. Or rather, the lack of it. Sheets were rarely washed. Mattresses were almost never cleaned. The idea of removing all bedding and washing it regularly was not standard practice. Water had to be hauled. Soap was expensive. Drying took time. So bedding absorbed sweat, skin, oils, whatever life produced. And medieval people accepted this, because everyone else smelled the same. Now let's float, gently, toward the emotional reality of medieval sleep. Sleep was not guaranteed. Nights were dark. Candles were expensive. People went to bed early. They woke up early. They also woke up in the middle of the night. This was normal. There was something called first sleep and second sleep. People slept for a few hours. Woke up. Prayed. Talked. Did small tasks. Then went back to bed. This wasn't insomnia. It was routine. Beds were not designed for 8 uninterrupted hours. They were designed for survival. And that's really the theme here. Medieval beds were not about comfort. They were about getting through the night. Warm enough. Dry enough. Alive in the morning. So as you lie there now, on your modern mattress, with your clean sheets, your temperature-controlled room, your complete lack of rats, just remember, at least your bed does not involve straw, or livestock, or a servant quietly watching you fall asleep, because it's part of their job. And with that gentle thought, we'll slowly drift onward, away from the bed itself, and toward the people who slept in them. And the very strangely, hey guys, it was believed to be a presence. Something active. Something that hid things. And encouraged them. Medieval thinkers genuinely believed that bad things preferred the dark. And to be fair, most of them did. Crime happened at night. Animals hunted at night. Illness was worse at night. Death often arrived quietly, in the dark, while everyone else slept. So night wasn't neutral. It was suspicious. Now add thieves. Thieves loved the dark. Of course they did. Locks were simple. Doors were thin. Windows were basically suggestions. A medieval home was not a fortress, even for the wealthy. And if you lived in a city, things were worse. Cities were cramped. Buildings leaned into each other. Alleys twisted and vanished. At night, these places became perfect hiding spots. Guards existed, yes. But there were few of them. And they were human. They got tired. They missed things. So the idea that someone might be outside your door at night was not paranoia. It was awareness. People slept lightly. They listened. Any sound mattered. Footsteps. Wood creaking. An unfamiliar cough. Night trained people to be alert even while resting, which is not great for deep sleep. Now let's gently drift toward spirits, because of course they were involved. Medieval people lived in a world where the supernatural wasn't a genre. It was a feature. Ghosts weren't entertainment. They were neighbors who refused to move on. Spirits walked at night. Demons worked at night. Witches, obviously, were busiest at night. Darkness was when the boundary between worlds thinned. At least, that's what everyone believed. So if something strange happened after sunset, the explanation wasn't, "That was weird." It was, "Yes. That tracks." A strange noise in the dark wasn't the house settling. It was something watching. Or testing. Or waiting. And no, this wasn't limited to peasants. The educated elite believed this too. Kings. Queens. Clergy. They all accepted that night belonged to forces that were not entirely friendly. Which brings us to religion. Christianity shaped medieval fear in a very specific way. Night was associated with sin, with temptation, with moral weakness. People believed that the devil worked best in the dark. That sleep itself made you vulnerable. Dreams could be messages, or warnings, or attacks. So bedtime prayers weren't optional. They were protective rituals. You prayed before sleep not to relax, but to survive the night intact. Now imagine being a child. Medieval childhood was already rough. Add night fears to that. Children slept in shared spaces. They heard everything. They listened to adults talk about spirits. They heard sermons describing hell in loving detail. They absorbed warnings about demons slipping into rooms. If prayers were forgotten. So when the lights went out, their imaginations had plenty to work with. And no one told them monsters weren't real. Because adults didn't believe that either. Now let's quietly shift toward the elite. Because fear didn't disappear with wealth. Castles were large, drafty, echo-filled. At night, they became strange places. Stone hallways amplified sound. Wind moved through arrow slits. Tapestries shifted. A castle at night did not feel secure. It felt alive. Servants moved quietly. Guards changed shifts. Torches flickered. And nobles slept knowing that betrayal was always an option. Assassination was not unheard of. Poisoning was fashionable. Rebellions happened while people slept. So kings didn't just fear spirits. They feared people. A rustle outside the door could mean anything. A servant. A spy. Someone who had decided tonight was the night. So even the powerful slept lightly. Now let's talk about night rules, because medieval society tried very hard to control darkness. Cities had curfews. Gates were closed at sunset. Movement was restricted. Not because they hated fun, but because chaos thrived after dark. If you were out at night without reason, you were suspicious. Nighttime was when laws loosened, and consequences blurred, which meant authorities preferred people inside. Still. Predictable. But even inside, fear followed. Windows were shuttered. Doors were barred. Candles were extinguished early. And then came the quiet. That deep, medieval quiet. No engines. No distant traffic. No electronic hum. Just wind. And animals. And the occasional scream from somewhere you couldn't see. Which, yes, happened. People cried out at night. From pain. From illness. From fear. And hearing that, without context, in total darkness, was unsettling. Now let's gently float over to night watchmen, because they deserve a mention. These were men tasked with patrolling after dark. They carried lanterns. They called out the hours. Their voices were reassuring. A reminder that someone was awake. That the world hadn't fully dissolved into shadow. But they were few. And they couldn't be everywhere. So most of the night was unobserved. Which brings us back to sleep. Sleep in medieval times was not surrender. It was negotiation. You lay down, knowing you might wake up. You listened. You trusted routines and prayers and habits. People slept in stages. Woke up easily. Checked the room. Listened for danger. Night was something to get through. Not enjoy. And yet, people adapted. Fear became normal. Darkness became familiar. Children grew up learning the sounds of night. Adults learned which fears were worth attention. And which were just the house settling. Life adjusted around the dark. And slowly, very slowly, night became less terrifying. Not because it changed, but because people learned how to exist within it. So as you lie here now, safe, lit, comfortable, with your door locked and your world glowing softly, just remember, for centuries, night was the most dangerous part of the day. And people faced it anyway. Every single evening. And with that thought, we'll drift onward. Away from the fear itself. And toward the strange individuals. Who believed they could control the night. Or bargain with it. Or outsmart it entirely. Hey guys. Tonight, we're slowing things down. Maybe you've already dimmed the lights. Maybe your phone is face down on the pillow. Either way, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're drifting back into medieval winter nights. Long nights. Cold nights. The kind of nights where silence felt louder than daylight. Where sleep wasn't guaranteed, privacy didn't exist, and warmth was a shared resource. So take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. And let's begin. In the medieval world, night was not a cozy concept. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't peaceful. It was something to endure. When the sun went down in winter, it really went down. No streetlights. No glowing windows. Just darkness. Deep, layered darkness. And cold. So much cold. Most people didn't sleep alone. Not because they were lonely, but because being alone was inefficient. Heat mattered more than dignity. Peasants slept packed together like human firewood. Families, servants, children, sometimes even animals. Everyone breathing into the same stale air. Everyone wrapped in whatever fabric hadn't already fallen apart. Beds, when they existed, were usually wooden frames. Inside them, straw. Old straw. Reused straw. Straw that had opinions. It poked. It shifted. It smelled faintly of damp fields and regret. But it was better than the floor. Usually. Now, if you were rich, things improved slightly. And by slightly, I mean your straw was covered with a mattress stuffed with feathers. Feathers that once belonged to birds who probably lived better lives than most medieval peasants. Royal beds were massive. Huge wooden structures with curtains on all sides. Not for luxury. For survival. Those curtains trapped warmth. They also trapped smells. And whispers. And sometimes, entire groups of people. Because kings and queens rarely slept alone either. Royal sleeping chambers were public spaces. Servants came and went. Attendants slept nearby. Guards stood watch. Courtiers lingered too long. Privacy was a modern invention. Back then, sleep was a performance. A king going to bed was an event. Layers of clothing removed slowly. Ceremonially. Witnessed. Because even unconscious, a king needed an audience. Of course he did. Now let's slide gently into winter nights. Because winter made everything worse. Fireplaces existed, yes. But they were inefficient. Drafty. Hungry for wood. Heat escaped faster than it arrived. Castles were stone refrigerators. Designed to intimidate enemies. Not to keep anyone comfortable. So people clustered. Bodies pressed together. Nobles and servants alike pretending not to notice. Children slept with parents. Siblings slept in piles. Guests shared beds with strangers. If you were traveling and someone offered you a bed, that bed already had someone in it. And you said thank you. Monks slept in dormitories. Rows of beds. Minimal blankets. Maximum discipline. Because freezing together built character. Apparently. Now let's drift over to the royals. Because winter nights hit them differently. Take King Henry IV of England. Suffered from chronic illness. Likely skin conditions. Painful joints. Winter nights for him were long. Itching. Sleepless. He reportedly slept surrounded by attendants, not for comfort, but because he feared dying in his sleep. And honestly, fair. Medieval medicine didn't offer reassurance. It offered leeches. Queens had their own nighttime rituals. Layers of gowns removed. Hair unbound. Braids undone slowly. Sleep was one of the few moments a queen wasn't required to look symbolic. But even then, she wasn't alone. Ladies-in-waiting slept nearby. Sometimes in the same bed. Shared warmth. Shared gossip. Shared exhaustion. Let's float gently toward France. At the court of the Valois kings, beds were often communal. Not because they wanted intimacy, but because space was political. Where you slept mattered. Who you slept near mattered. Sleeping close to power meant favor. Sleeping far away meant you were being quietly removed from relevance. And winter nights made everything tighter. Rooms closed. Windows sealed. People condensed. Imagine the smells. Wool. Sweat. Smoke. Unwashed bodies layered in expensive fabric. Now imagine trying to relax. Sleep came in pieces. Segments. People often slept twice. A first sleep. Then waking for an hour or two. Then a second sleep. During that waking hour, people prayed. Talked. Had quiet conversations. Or just lay there, staring into darkness, listening to someone else breathe too loudly. Children learned fear early. Darkness wasn't empty. It was alive. Spirits. Thieves. Wolves. The night was a thing that could reach in. So shared sleeping spaces offered psychological warmth too. If something came for you, at least it would come for everyone. Now let's glide toward medieval noble children. They rarely slept alone. Not because they were cherished, but because they were valuable. Children were fragile assets. Illness spread easily in winter. So they slept where they could be watched. Monitored. Heard. A cough in the night could mean death. Royal children often slept in rooms full of adults. Servants. Guards. Wet nurses. Sleep was noisy. Uneven. And winter nights stretched endlessly. Candles burned low. Shadows flickered. People whispered stories. Legends. Warnings. Because fear liked company. Now let's gently drift toward the Holy Roman Empire. Because nothing says comfort like political fragmentation. German nobles slept in thick stone keeps. Beds piled with furs. Wolf. Bear. Fox. The animals got the last laugh. These furs were heavy. Claustrophobic. You didn't move much once you were under them. If you needed to get up, you committed to the cold. No half measures. Which is why many people didn't bother. Chamber pots existed for a reason. Winter nights encouraged stillness. Now let's soften our focus again. Because this isn't about suffering. It's about endurance. Shared sleep made people resilient. Adaptable. It also meant no secrets. Snoring. Talking in sleep. Crying. Everything was heard. Kings were human at night. Queens too. And winter night stripped away illusion. Titles didn't generate heat. Crowns didn't stop drafts. Everyone shivered the same way. As the fire crackled low. As the room darkened. As bodies pressed closer. And eventually, sleep arrived. Not deep. Not uninterrupted. But enough. Enough to face another cold morning. And as we drift forward, we'll move from shared beds into shared fears, shared superstitions, and the strange things medieval minds did to survive the dark. But for now, just rest here. In the warmth. In the quiet rhythm of breathing bodies. We'll continue soon. Hey guys. Tonight, let's slow everything way down. If you're listening in bed, that's perfect. If you're still awake but pretending you're not, also perfect. Tonight we're drifting into the medieval night. Not the dramatic, torchlit kind from movies. The quiet kind. The repetitive kind. The kind filled with prayers, routines, and people standing very still in the dark, trying not to fall asleep while holding sharp objects. So take a breath. Let your jaw unclench. And let's begin. When night fell in medieval Europe, it didn't arrive gently. There was no gradual fade. No ambient glow. It was day. And then it was not day. Darkness slammed into towns and castles like a heavy curtain. And everyone responded the same way. By getting very serious. Night was dangerous. Not exciting dangerous. Just inconveniently threatening. You couldn't see. You couldn't move easily. And if something went wrong, help was far away and half asleep. So people developed routines. Endless routines. Because routine felt like control. Let's start with prayer. Because medieval nights were extremely religious. Whether you wanted them to be or not. Most people prayed before sleep. Not dramatically. Quietly. Automatically. Short prayers memorized in childhood. The same words every night. Like a mental lullaby. These weren't poetic moments. They were insurance policies. Because dying in your sleep was common. Illness. Cold. Heart issues no one understood. So people prayed just in case. Kings prayed. Queens prayed. Servants prayed. Sometimes together. Sometimes alone. In monasteries, night prayers were scheduled. Of course they were. Monks woke in the dark. Stood in cold stone chapels. Chanted in low, steady voices. No emotion. No improvisation. Just rhythm. Because rhythm keeps you awake. And barely awake was the goal. Now let's gently drift to royal households. Because their nights were structured chaos. A king's nighttime routine was formal. Almost theatrical. He didn't just go to bed. He retired. Servants followed. Candles were lit. Curtains were drawn. Clothing was removed layer by layer. Not for intimacy. For accountability. Because even a king undressing had witnesses. Of course he did. Then came prayer. Often led by a chaplain. The king might kneel. Or sit. Or just stand there looking tired. Kings were deeply religious. And deeply exhausted. After prayer, guards took their positions. Now, guards at night weren't heroic figures. They were cold men with sore feet. Standing still. Listening. Trying to stay awake while nothing happened. Guards rotated shifts. Some patrolled halls. Some stood outside doors. Some guarded staircases that went nowhere important. But tradition said they mattered. Torches flickered. Shadows stretched. Every sound mattered too much. A cough echoed. Footsteps sounded suspicious. A mouse caused emotional distress. And guards prayed too. Quietly. Because being alert didn't stop fate. Queens had their own routines. Usually separate. Sometimes not. Queens prayed longer. Not because they were holier. But because they had more to worry about. Pregnancy. Miscarriage. Childbirth. Night was when anxiety lived. Queens slept surrounded by women. Ladies in waiting. Attendants. Someone always nearby. Because a queen alone at night was dangerous. Not physically. Politically. Now let's float gently toward castles. Because castles never really slept. Someone was always awake. Guards. Servants. Clerks copying documents by candlelight. The night shift existed. It was just miserable. Fireplaces were banked low. Just enough embers to survive until morning. Too much fire meant risk. Too little meant freezing. Balance mattered. Now let's talk about the midnight hour. Because medieval people loved midnight. And feared it. Midnight was when the world felt thin. Not dramatic thin. Just uncertain. People believed spirits moved more freely. Not monsters. Just things. Unseen presences. Uncomfortable thoughts. So many routines focused on passing midnight safely. Extra prayers. Extra checks. Doors tested. Locks examined. Because once midnight passed, you were closer to morning. And morning meant safety. Now let's gently drift to one of history's favorite insomniacs. King Charles VI of France. He suffered from mental illness. Episodes of paranoia. Fear. Night terrified him. He slept surrounded by guards. Candles burning. Doors barred. He feared assassination. Poison. Betrayal. And night made everything louder. His routines were obsessive. Repetitive. Because repetition calmed him. Of course it did. Now let's slide toward England, where medieval kings were also deeply uncomfortable at night. Henry III slept lightly, surrounded by attendants. He reportedly disliked silence. Which makes sense. Silence leaves room for thoughts. So someone was always nearby. Breathing. Moving. Noise as comfort. Now let's float into noble households. Nobles weren't much better off. Their homes were drafty. Their halls echoed. So nighttime routines focused on closure. Doors shut. Curtains drawn. Candles extinguished one by one. Darkness crept inward slowly. Servants locked chests. Secured silver. Checked inventories. Because theft often came from inside. And night revealed character. Now let's talk about sleep interruptions. Because sleep was never uninterrupted. People woke to pray. To check fires. To listen. Especially parents. Children coughed at night. Cried. Shifted. And parents listened constantly. Silence was sometimes worse than noise. Now let's drift into superstition. Because routines weren't only practical. They were symbolic. Certain prayers said backwards were avoided. Certain words weren't spoken. Candles were snuffed carefully. Never blown out. Because breath carried meaning. Windows were shuttered. Not just for cold. For protection. And bells. Church bells rang at night sometimes. Not to wake people. But to remind them they weren't alone. Now let's gently slide toward guards again. Because they carried the night. Guards were expected to notice everything. Footsteps. Breathing. The absence of sound. They leaned on spears. Shifted weight. Fought sleep. Some hummed quietly. Others prayed silently. A sleeping guard was a dead guard. Not immediately. But eventually. So fear kept them awake. Now let's soften again. As the night deepened, routine slowed. Candles burned low. Breathing synchronized. The castle settled. People drifted into shallow sleep. Woke. Drifted again. This was normal. No one expected 8 uninterrupted hours. That idea hadn't arrived yet. Now let's float toward early morning. Not sunrise. Just before it. The quietest hour. Guards shifted. Prayers ended. Someone stirred the fire. And night loosened its grip. People relaxed slightly. Just a little. Because they'd survived another one. And as we drift forward, we'll explore what people feared most in the dark. Not monsters. Not legends. But thoughts. Dreams. And the quiet realization of how fragile everything was. For now. Rest here. In the soft repetition of routine. In the comfort of predictability. We'll continue soon. Hey guys. Welcome back. If you drifted a little during the last part, that's perfect. That means it's working. So settle back in. Adjust your pillow if you need to. And let's keep moving through the medieval night. Because once the prayers were finished, once the guards settled into their positions, once the routines had done their best to impose order, what remained was the mind. And medieval minds were not gentle places at night. People feared darkness, yes. But not in a jump scare way. Not monsters leaping out of shadows. It was quieter than that. They feared what darkness allowed. Silence. Thoughts. Dreams. And dreams mattered far more than they do now. Dreams weren't random. They weren't brain noise. They were messages. Warnings. Prophecies. Spiritual audits. If you dreamed of falling, something was wrong. If you dreamed of fire, something was worse. If you dreamed of someone dead, well, that required a priest. So night wasn't just rest. It was risk. Let's float gently into medieval bedrooms again. Because this is where fear lived most comfortably. Rooms were dark. Truly dark. No ambient glow. No digital clocks. Once the candles were out, the world disappeared. And people lay there. Listening. Wood creaked. Stone popped. Wind pressed against shutters. Every sound felt intentional. And the imagination filled in the rest. Now let's talk about what people didn't say at night. Names mattered. Certain things were not named after sunset. Evil spirits. Bad luck. Illness. You didn't invite attention. If someone felt sick at night, they waited until morning to complain. Because night belonged to other forces. Now let's drift toward royalty again. Because even kings were not immune to this. King James I of England. Famously anxious. Deeply superstitious. Night terrified him. He believed witches were real. Active. Persistent. And of course he did. James slept lightly. Often waking. Listening. Dreams unsettled him deeply. And if the king had a bad dream, everyone noticed. Because a royal nightmare could turn into policy. Now let's slide toward medieval queens. Queens feared night for different reasons. Pregnancy dreams were taken seriously. Painfully seriously. A dream about blood could mean danger. A dream about water could mean death. So queens reported dreams, interpreted them, adjusted routines accordingly. Dreams influenced real decisions, which feels wild, but also relatable at 3 a.m. Now let's gently float into monasteries again. Monks feared dreams too, especially vivid ones. Dreams were temptations, tests. If a monk dreamed of pleasure, it wasn't indulgent. It was sinful. So monks woke from dreams ashamed, confessed them, analyzed them. Night was a battlefield. Quiet. Internal. Now let's drift toward noble children. Children feared night intensely, but no one soothed them. Fear built character. Apparently, children slept surrounded by adults. But emotional comfort wasn't the goal. Silence was. Crying was discouraged. Nighttime emotions were inconvenient. So children learned to be still. Now let's talk about nightmares. Nightmares weren't psychological events. They were attacks. The night hag. Sleep paralysis. Weight on the chest. People described identical experiences across Europe. Waking unable to move. Feeling pressure. Feeling watched. And they didn't say, "That was my brain." They said, "Something visited me." Which made night feel personal. Now let's float gently into the aristocracy again. The Habsburgs. Of course. Deeply inbred. Physically fragile. Emotionally anxious. Night magnified everything. Insomnia was common. Pain. Breathing issues. And dreams weren't comforting. Charles II of Spain reportedly slept poorly his entire life. Weak. Ill. Terrified of dying in his sleep. Which, fair. He was surrounded by priests. Praying. Constantly. His sleep was a ritual of fear management. Now let's soften again. Night also brought reflection. People thought about death more at night. Not dramatically. Practically. You lay down. You closed your eyes. You might not wake up. That was accepted. So people made peace with it nightly. Short prayers. Small regrets. No long emotional processing. Just acceptance. Now let's drift into castles again. Castles amplified sound. Echoes traveled. So a footstep far away sounded close. A whisper sounded intentional. Guards listened constantly. Sometimes nothing happened. Which was unsettling. Now let's talk about night visitors. Not ghosts. People. Messengers arrived at night. Bad news didn't wait for morning. Deaths. Wars. Betrayals. Knocks in the dark were serious. And when someone knocked, the whole household woke. Fear spread quietly. Now let's float toward superstition again. Mirrors were covered at night in some households. Not everywhere, but often enough. Reflections felt unstable in candlelight. People avoided looking too closely at themselves in the dark, because faces looked wrong. Now let's drift gently toward the end of night. The hour before dawn was the hardest, coldest, quietest. Sleep was shallow. Dreams blurred into waking. People stirred. Listened for birds. Because birds meant survival. Now let's soften. Night wasn't evil. It was honest. It removed distraction. Stripped things down. Which made people uncomfortable. So they filled it with prayer. Routine. Presence. And when morning finally arrived, it felt earned. And as we move forward, we'll drift into what people did at night when sleep refused to come. Quiet work. Whispered conversations. And the strange intimacy of shared insomnia. For now, stay still. Let the quiet hold you. We'll continue when you're ready.